Hello and welcome to This Week in the Garden. In this week's episode, we're going to go over the onion harvest. This is one of the first things that I planted in my garden, and so in today's episode, we're going to go over how do you know your onions are ready to harvest. We're going to talk about the actual harvest itself, how to store the onions properly, and then we'll go over my take of onions. If you've never grown onions before, maybe that'll be helpful to you. Now, if you look at my onion patch here, kind of beside and behind me, you'll see that there's really not that many onions left. I've already harvested once, so we could talk about the storage. So that was about a week ago. But anyways, when you know that your onions are ready to harvest, you'll notice that the tops start to flop over, and that's what we can see here and all along the back. Now, this will happen naturally when the onions start to mature. However, it doesn't necessarily happen all at once. And so what I've done is I've gone through and I've pushed some of the tops over. That way everything can harvest at the same time. Now, I did that about 2 days ago, and that'll allow the onions to start to dry a little bit in the soil. So that's the first thing when you want to be harvesting mature onions. Now, you can harvest your onions really throughout the season. You can harvest them as spring onions earlier in the year. You can take the tops off of them and put those in dishes similar to chives. But I wanted to grow mature onions that way I could store them. So this is kind of what they look like. Now, when you go to harvest the onions, what you're going to do is pull them from the tops and pull them gently out of the ground. And then you're basically going to leave them like that. You don't want to remove any of the skin. You can leave the dirt on there, aside from if you have any big clumps. But that's really the onion harvest. So we're going to go and harvest the onions, finish harvesting the onions really quickly, and then we're going to head to the garage where we're going to store and dry the onions. Now that the onion harvest is over, we're back here in my garage, and you may have seen me struggle with a couple onions. That's all right. I'm going to go back with a small shovel and get those. But also, some of those onions were actually rotten. And so what you're looking for when you notice a rotten onion is something that's a little bit soft or a little squishy. If you can see this onion from there, you can see that I can really squish the bulb of the onion. That's an onion that you don't want to eat. Sometimes you'll have onions that are squishy right around the top, and what I recommend for those is to go ahead and use those. Don't try to store them. But we're here in my garage, and this is kind of where I like to store my onions. Now, when you're storing your onions, you want to put them in a place that is going to be dry, out of the sun, and has good airflow. And so that's why I've come here to my garage. I usually leave the door open. That allows some airflow when I'm home or when my wife is home. And so that's helping to allow my onions to dry out. Now, this is a short-term storage drying process that you need to do for your onions to allow the tops to dry out as well as the roots. And so that's why I put them here on this little shelf. It's got some holes in it, and so I lay the onions out on those. Now, when I'm laying out the onions, I want to make sure that I put the bulbs so that there's airflow around them. So there's plenty of room for that airflow around the bulbs. And so I'll lay them out across this shelf, and then you'll leave them for about a week. Now, after a week, your onions will start to look like this. The tops should dry out almost completely, and I don't know if you can hear it, but they're very dry. The roots will also start to dry out. So this is your first step of your drying process. What you're going to do is clip the tops of the onions off just like you would get them in the store, right where that dry material is. So I'm going to clip mine about right there. And some shears will work fine, or you can use some scissors if you have any. But you'll want to leave a little bit of extra because it'll still dry in this area here right on the tip of the bulb. And then what you want to do too is you'll want to remove those roots, just like you see them at the store when you get them in a bag. And so again, I just use the shears to remove the roots. That's kind of what they'll look like there. And then just brush off any of that dirt, any of the really big chunks of the dirt that you might have. Be careful not to wipe off any of the skin though. And so that's really stage 1 of your drying process. Now, if the tops are still a little wet, or maybe the roots are still a little wet, you'll want to leave them for an additional week. And this one's a little wet still on the top, so I'm going to put it back on the shelf and let it sit for a week. Now, when we go to long-term storage, you can put them in a mesh bag similar to what you get in the stores, or you can put them in pantyhose. And that's probably what I'm going to do, because I don't know if I'll be able to find some of those mesh bags available at the store. So I'm going to get some pantyhose, put the onions in those, and then you're going to want to store them in a dry area that's dark. And so I'm going to put them in the pantry in my house. But that's really the process of harvesting, drying, and storing your onions. Onions were something that I've never grown before. They were very easy to grow in this area. I just planted them as small little bulbs in the spring. I didn't do too much work. The one thing is they do like fertilizer, so I periodically added fertilizer, and that's how some of my onions got to be the size they are. But the hardest thing about the onions was weeding. I had to make sure that when I was weeding the onions that I didn't weed too strong or too heavily, because if you pull out the weeds, you might also pull out the onions. They don't have a lot of green foliage on top, so they're not going to shade out weeds, so you will get a lot of weeds with onions. But that was really the hardest thing. The other kind of troubleshooting thing I noticed was that some of the onions, when I harvested them, were rotten, and that is because they were sitting in lower areas on that bed. So you want to make sure that they're not sitting in low areas. If you have sandy soil, they'll grow great. But that's all we have for this week's episode on harvesting onions. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. If not, stay tuned for next week's episode, where we're going to finally harvest our potato tower. And so that'll be a fun episode. I'll do that one live in front of y'all. I'll open up the cages and everything will fall out, and hopefully we'll have some potatoes. So make sure that you stay tuned for next time on This Week in the Garden.